They thought they had him cornered. Locked away in a high-security prison, deep in the heart of an alien empire, humanity's most defiant rebel was supposed to be just another casualty in their war. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated him. They thought that walls, bars, and a few hundred guards could keep him from doing what humans do best: adapt and fight back. From the moment he stepped into that cold, sterile cell, his mind was already calculating. The chains that bound him didn't hold his spirit. The damp, gray walls became the canvas for his most dangerous plan yet. The prison, once thought to be an inescapable fortress, was about to become his command center. Not a place of captivity, but a launch pad for revolution. His captors thought they could break him. But every day, as the hum of the prison's automated systems echoed through the hallways, he found new ways to slip past their surveillance, hack into their networks, and turn their own technology against them. It didn't matter how advanced their systems were or how many times they reinforced their security. To him, it was just another challenge, one he was born to conquer. The guards didn't know it yet. Every movement they made, every routine they followed, was being watched. Their every conversation was being recorded. With each passing day, the prison became more of his own, a microcosm of his rebellion, growing in the shadows. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was the architect of his own freedom, and soon he would show them just how dangerous a human could be when backed into a corner. As word of his success began to spread among the other prisoners, the situation began to shift. It wasn't just one man fighting for his life anymore. It was a spark, igniting a fire in the hearts of those who had long given up hope. The walls were closing in on their captors, but the real war had just begun. And then, as if to taunt them, a sudden breach in the prison's outer defenses triggered a silent alarm. They were no longer safe. The rebel had made his move. The question was no longer whether he could escape, it was what he was planning to do once he was free. The last message they received from the prison sent a chill down their spines. This isn't an escape. This is just the beginning. As the rebels' plan unfolds, everything the Empire had worked for starts to unravel. But there's a twist in the works, an unexpected turn that will change everything they thought they knew about their human adversaries. What will he do next, and how will the Empire fight back? The answer may be far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The Empire thought they had learned their lesson after the first few failed attempts at containing humanity's defiance. They had underestimated how much one human could disrupt their plans. But they had learned from their mistakes, investing in technology and resources to ensure that no prisoner could ever escape again. Their prisons were state-of-the-art, each one a fortress designed not only to hold, but to break the will of anyone foolish enough to challenge the Empire. But no one had counted on him. The rebel, a figure whose name had been whispered in hushed tones in the darkest corners of the galaxy, wasn't just another soldier, freedom fighter, or terrorist. He wasn't even one of those rare humans known for their cunning or resourcefulness. He was something different, something the Empire had never seen before. It wasn't just his physical strength or his ability to adapt to almost any situation. It was his mind, sharp, calculating, relentless. A mind that never stopped moving, always 5 steps ahead. He'd spent years evading capture, outsmarting military patrols, outlasting the Empire's most skilled agents. And now, locked behind the walls of their prison, they believed they could finally break him. But in the silence of his cell, his mind was working overtime, and with every passing day, he grew stronger. The Empire's commanders had no idea that, beneath the surface of this impenetrable facility, their most dangerous prisoner had already begun to weave a web of control. What they didn't realize was that they had handed him the perfect resources, access to their own systems. The surveillance cameras, once tools of oppression, were now his eyes. Communication networks, once secure, had become his lifeline. Every inch of the prison was mapped out in his mind. Every guard's schedule was burned into his memory. It wasn't just escape he was planning anymore. It was something far greater, a rebellion, not just within the prison, but against the very core of the Empire. He had begun quietly speaking to other prisoners, sowing seeds of hope in their hearts. It wasn't long before whispers of a revolution began to circulate. What had once been a handful of prisoners, broken and isolated, now had a plan. It was no longer about survival. It was about taking the fight to the Empire itself. But the Empire was no fool. They knew the stakes had risen. As soon as they realized that something was off, they ramped up their security measures. They increased patrols, scanned communications, and fortified the prison's defenses. Still, the rebels' influence continued to grow. Every time they tightened their grip, he found a new way to slip through their fingers. He knew it was only a matter of time before they realized he wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was the leader of something much larger. Yet, in the midst of all this tension, a disturbing development emerged. A new figure, someone with a reputation as dangerous as the rebels, was seen in the shadows of the prison. No one knew who they were or what their motives might be, but their presence was undeniable. And their connection to the Empire seemed too close for comfort. Just as the rebel began to prepare for the next phase of his plan, he received a cryptic message. It was brief, just a single line of text, "They know." A chill ran down his spine as the realization hit him. The Empire had figured out what he was planning. But worse, they knew he was no longer alone. Whoever this new player was, they were a threat. And if they got to him before he could act, everything he'd worked for could be lost in an instant. With time running out, he had no choice but to act. But as he stood on the edge of the precipice, ready to make his move, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the Empire, but this mysterious new figure. The game had just shifted, and he had no idea what the next move would be. And as the alarms began to blare throughout the prison once more, signaling another breach in security, the rebels' pulse quickened. The Empire might have had their plan, but now he had his. But the question remained, who would be the one left standing when the dust settled? The rebels' mind raced as the sirens blared throughout the prison. The breach alarms had been triggered, but this wasn't like the last few times. This wasn't some minor malfunction or a prisoner trying to escape. No, something far more dangerous was unfolding. He could feel it in the air, the shift in the balance of power. He had spent months carefully building his network, slowly gaining the trust of the other prisoners, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he had been creating an underground resistance. It wasn't just about breaking out. It was about making a statement, showing the Empire that humans would never be subjugated, never be broken. But now, as the alarms sounded again, the rebellion he had set in motion felt like a fragile thing, and yet somehow inevitable. The mysterious figure, who'd been seen only in whispers and rumors, was now becoming a real threat. He had heard murmurs in the shadows of the prison. A name had come up, something he didn't recognize. A name that sent a chill down his spine, the Warden. The Warden wasn't just a figurehead or a high-ranking officer of the Empire. No, this was something far worse. This was someone with deep ties to the Empire, someone with knowledge of the human psyche, someone who understood how to break people, how to control them from within. And that was exactly what the rebel feared. The Empire had always relied on brute force, on technology, on overwhelming their enemies. But this new figure, the Warden, was different. It wasn't just about strength. It was about manipulation, about playing the long game. He was no ordinary foe. He could see through the rebels' plans before they even came to fruition. It was as though the Warden had been waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. And now, it seemed, the time had come. But there was more to the story than just the rebels' internal struggle. Inside the prison, the growing tensions were becoming impossible to ignore. Prisoners, once hesitant and isolated, were now rallying behind the rebel. They felt it too, the shift in power, the weight of the moment. A small group had already started to prepare, making covert moves to sabotage the Empire's operations, attacking guards, and triggering small-scale disruptions. It was chaotic, dangerous, and yet it felt like the first real taste of freedom they had ever known. Still, as the walls of the prison closed in tighter, the rebel knew it wasn't enough. The Empire was vast, and their grip was unyielding. He had to do more than just destabilize the prison. He needed a signal, something that would let the Empire know the human spirit was not easily crushed. But how could he accomplish such a thing with the Empire's surveillance growing more sophisticated by the hour? How could he strike fear into their hearts when his every move was being watched? The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and the rebel's pulse quickened. He had anticipated this. The warden had already set his eyes on him. The time for careful plotting was over. Now, he had to act. But what was his next move? Should he continue to rally the prisoners, risk everything on a full-scale uprising? Or was it better to retreat for now, regroup, and wait for the right moment? The warden's influence was creeping through the prison like a shadow, and with every passing minute, the rebel could feel the walls closing in. His allies were scattered, unsure of how to proceed. Some were eager for the fight, while others feared the wrath of the Empire's new enforcer. Yet, even in the face of such uncertainty, the rebel felt something stir within him. This was not just a fight for survival. This was a fight for humanity's very soul. As the rebel stood at the heart of the prison, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, he received another cryptic message. It was brief, but to the point. He's here. The warden was not just a figure in the shadows anymore. He was in the prison, and time was running out. The tension was thick enough to choke anyone who dared to breathe. The walls, once a symbol of captivity, now felt like the last barrier between the rebel and total chaos. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever happened next, everything was about to change. But before he could process the enormity of the situation, a blast, distant yet powerful, rumbled through the halls. The rebel's heart skipped a beat. This was no longer just a prison break. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would change the course of the galaxy forever. And as the first blast echoed, the rebel realized one terrifying truth. The Empire was prepared to burn everything to the ground to stop him. The tremor from the blast sent a shockwave through the prison, rattling the walls and knocking over equipment. The rebel's instincts kicked in, and he was already moving before his mind could catch up. His heart raced, each beat synchronized with the chaotic pulse of the prison. Every guard within the compound would be on high alert now. They would be looking for the source, trying to identify the origin of the explosion. But he couldn't afford to wait. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He sprinted through the narrow hallways, each turn more familiar than the last. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to anticipate the Empire's next move. They couldn't be this vulnerable for long. The blast was just the beginning. But what had set it off? Was it one of his own allies, a desperate attempt to give him an advantage? Or had the Empire launched their own assault, realizing that their grip on the prison was slipping? The rebel didn't have time to think about it. His only focus was getting to the central control room, where the heart of the prison's security systems lay. If he could take control, he could shut down the surveillance, scramble the guards' communications, and buy his allies precious time. Time for what? Time to escape, to strike back, to win. But for that, he had to be fast. The sound of boots pounding down the hallway snapped him back to the present. His pulse quickened, but he remained focused. He darted into a side room, hoping to avoid detection. Peering through the crack in the door, he saw a squad of heavily armed guards rush past. They were moving with purpose, all heading in the direction of the blast's epicenter. The rebel knew the warden would be close. Now he could feel the change in the air. The warden didn't just control the prison. He controlled the minds of everyone within it. And if he was already onto the rebel, it wouldn't be long before he had him cornered. The rebel pulled away from the door, slipping deeper into the maze of corridors. The plan was simple, but the execution was always in question. If he could reach the control room and initiate a lockdown, it would be the perfect counterattack. He knew the risks, but at this point, there was no turning back. The rebellion was already in motion, and the entire prison was on the edge of an all-out uprising. He had to keep pushing forward, no matter the odds. But as he neared the control room, he sensed something else in the air, something darker. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. There was an eerie stillness, as if the prison had gone silent in anticipation. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even though he had yet to encounter any resistance. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure in the distance, moving with deliberate precision. Tall, commanding, and cloaked in shadows. The warden. He had arrived. The rebel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what this meant. The warden was no longer just a ghost in the machine. He was here, in the flesh, ready to confront him. And with him came an army of soldiers, their weapons trained on every corner. The rebel's heart raced. This was it, the final confrontation. The rebel's mind was already calculating his next move, but the odds were stacked against him. The warden wasn't just a threat in terms of power. He was a master of manipulation, someone who had studied the rebel's every move, anticipated his every tactic. And now, standing just a few meters away, the warden locked eyes with him, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. "Did you really think this would end any other way?" The warden's voice was low, almost mocking, but there was a cold edge to it that sent a chill down the rebel's spine. The rebel didn't answer. There was no need. He knew the warden's words were just a distraction, a way to break his focus. But the rebel couldn't afford to be distracted now. He had to stay sharp, stay ahead of the game. This wasn't just a battle for freedom, it was a battle for survival. The sound of the prison's doors slamming shut echoed through the corridors. The lockdown had begun. The walls were closing in. There was no way out. The warden took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the rebel. "You have no idea what you're up against." The rebel's fingers twitched toward the hidden weapon at his side. The control room was just beyond that door. But would he make it in time? Or would the warden crush the rebellion before it even had a chance to rise? With every second that passed, the tension grew thicker. The rebel could feel the weight of the empire bearing down on him. Every choice, every movement would decide the fate of everything he had worked for. And then, as the lights dimmed one last time, a single word echoed through the prison, almost drowned out by the static, "now." In that instant, everything changed. The word "now" echoed in the rebel's ears like a death knell. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The lights flickered one last time, and the sound of his heartbeat drowned out the rest of the chaos. The warden's gaze never left him, the weight of that stare pinning him in place. His fingers tightened around the weapon at his side, but just as he prepared to make his move, the door to the control room burst open with a loud crash. A new figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the dim lights. The rebel's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't anyone from his group. No, this was someone much more dangerous. The stranger moved with fluid precision, their body language exuding the same cold control the warden possessed. They were neither ally nor enemy, but something far more insidious. The figure's eyes locked onto the rebels, and in that split second, something clicked. The way they moved, the way they seemed to be anticipating every shift in the air, it was almost as if they had been inside his head. As if they had been waiting for him. "Did you really think you were the only one capable of playing the game?" The voice was smooth, unsettlingly calm. The rebel's pulse raced as the words hung in the air. The warden stood still for a moment, his sharp gaze flicking from the rebel to the newcomer. It was clear that this wasn't a coincidence. The warden had been expecting this person, whoever they were. The air crackled with tension, the prison's heartbeat in sync with their growing standoff. "I knew you were smart," the warden said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you've always been one step behind, haven't you?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the rebel. "This is what happens when you fail to see the bigger picture." The rebel's mind reeled. He had thought the warden was the greatest threat, the one person who could bring down everything he'd worked for. But this new player, this mysterious figure, had appeared from nowhere, their arrival altering the very rules of the game. And worse, there was no telling which side they were on. Were they working with the warden? Or were they here to destroy both of them? The warden's smirk deepened, as if he had read the rebel's thoughts. "You're not the only one with resources, little rebel. You thought the Empire was the only force at play here? There are those who have been watching, waiting. And now they've come to collect." The rebel's heart pounded, but he refused to show fear. The control room loomed in front of him, his only shot at seizing the advantage. But with this new twist, his path was blocked on all sides. The walls were closing in faster than he could act. As if sensing the rebel's thoughts, the figure stepped forward, their hands moving fluidly and confidently toward the console. The rebel's eyes narrowed. Whoever they were no stranger to these systems. The figure was at home in the prison's heart, their presence almost as natural as the warden's. "This isn't your fight anymore," the figure said, their voice chillingly indifferent. "The game is far bigger than your petty rebellion." They paused, then added with a slight smirk, "You've only ever been a pawn." The rebel's stomach tightened. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable. Everything he had worked for, all the allies he had built, were now in jeopardy. This person wasn't just a threat to him, they were a threat to everything. His heart raced as he realized the true depth of their control. If they were working with the warden, they could crush him before he ever got close to the control room. Suddenly, the air around them began to vibrate, the prison itself seeming to hum with power. The console sparked, flickering to life in a display of light and shadow that made the rebel's skin prickle. The figure had taken control in an instant, overriding systems he couldn't even begin to understand. A low rumble echoed through the prison, a vibration deep in the earth that sent a chill down the rebel's spine. The ground shook beneath his feet. He glanced at the warden, whose face was unreadable. The tension between them had shifted. It wasn't about who was stronger anymore. It was about who was more prepared. The rebel's instincts screamed at him to move, to act before the walls of the prison locked him in for good. But as he began to take a step forward, a sharp sound sliced through the air, the unmistakable sound of weapons powering up. All around them, soldiers materialized from the shadows, their weapons drawn and aimed at the rebel. The warden's voice rang out, low and steady, as he addressed the newcomer. "It's time." And then the walls shuddered, a final warning. The rebel's eyes darted between the two enemies, the unknown figure and the warden, the stakes rising with each passing second. The rebellion had never been more fragile. The Empire had never been closer to crushing it. The rebel tightened his grip on his weapon, but with the odds so stacked against him, one question burned in his mind: was he just a pawn, or could he somehow turn the tide? And if he didn't act now, would there be a prison left to escape from? Everything was about to collapse, but into what? The rebellion's future and the fate of countless lives rested on his next move. But before he could make it, a loud voice echoed across the prison, signaling the beginning of a new phase in this dangerous game. "Initiate lockdown. Prepare for the final phase." And in that moment, the rebel realized that the final phase wasn't just the end of his escape. It was the beginning of something much more terrifying. The prison went silent for a fraction of a second, but in that stillness, the rebel could feel the weight of everything around him, the hum of the security systems, the breath of the soldiers, the looming threat of the warden, and the unknown figure. He had no choice now. He couldn't hesitate. The lockdown was active, and every door, every corridor was closing in on him. The game had shifted, and the rebel had to decide if he was going to be crushed beneath it or if he would find a way to escape it all. With a sudden burst of energy, he sprinted toward the nearest control panel, his mind racing to catch up with his body. The soldiers closed in, weapons raised, but the rebel was faster. He slid under the first barrage of shots, feeling the heat of them whizzing by his head. The figure in the corner of the room seemed unfazed, their eyes still fixed on the rebel as if everything was already over. But it wasn't. Not yet. He reached the panel and slammed his fist onto the emergency override switch, hoping against hope that it would work. For a split second, nothing happened, and the rebel's heart sank. But then, the console buzzed to life, and the lights flickered, casting a dim but hopeful glow across the room. The lockdown began to retract. The rebel had done it. He had gained a crucial advantage. But the victory was short-lived. The warden moved first, a speed and precision that belied his calm demeanor. With a single command, a dozen soldiers moved in to surround the rebel, their weapons raised. The rebel gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. The standoff had come to a head, and there was no turning back now. "You really thought you could win?" The warden's voice was like a snake's hiss. "You're just a cog in a machine far beyond your understanding." But the rebel didn't flinch. He stood tall, staring down the warden with a defiant gaze. "I'm not a cog. I'm the spark that starts the fire." Before the warden could respond, the sound of alarms cut through the tension. a high-pitched wail that vibrated through the walls. The rebel's mind raced. What was happening? The figure in the corner finally spoke, their voice calm and detached. You've made a mistake. This was never about your rebellion. The rebel's eyes widened. What do you mean? The figure stepped forward, revealing a hidden device on their wrist, a sleek, advanced piece of technology that hummed with energy. This prison wasn't just built to contain you. It was built to contain something else. Something much bigger than your petty rebellion. The warden, who had been standing in the background, suddenly stiffened. A look of horror crossed his face, a fleeting moment of vulnerability that only lasted a second. He turned to the figure. You know. This wasn't part of the plan. It was always part of the plan, the figure replied coolly. You just never realized that your empire's biggest enemy wasn't outside the prison walls. It was right here, within them. The rebel's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The prison was never just a holding facility. It was a containment unit for something far more dangerous. But what? Before he could ask, the walls trembled, the ground shaking beneath them. The entire facility seemed to groan, its very foundations cracking as something massive, something alien, began to stir beneath the surface. The rebel's eyes snapped toward the floor. A deep rumble filled the air, and he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a prison. It was a tomb for something ancient, something that had been kept locked away for far too long. The warden's face twisted in desperation. No, this can't be happening. This was supposed to be contained. We were supposed to control it. The figure, unfazed by the growing chaos, turned to face the rebel, their expression unreadable. Your rebellion was never meant to free humanity. It was meant to free it from its ignorance, to wake it up to the truth. The ground shook harder, and the rebel's feet slipped slightly as the tremors grew more violent. The warden's control over the situation was slipping away faster than he could comprehend. The figure continued, their voice steady even as the walls cracked and sparks flew from the damaged systems. You're not fighting a government. You're fighting an awakening. And then, as if to underscore their words, a massive door in the center of the control room slammed open, revealing the true horror hidden beneath the prison. From the shadows emerged a figure, a creature, impossibly tall and terrifying, its form shifting in a way that defied human comprehension. The prison had been holding it for centuries, and now it was free. The rebel's breath caught in his throat. This was the real enemy. Not the warden, not the empire, but something far older, something far more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. As the creature advanced, the rebel knew one thing: the game had changed once again. But this time, there was no plan. No backup. Only the will to survive. And then, just as the creature moved closer, ready to claim its first victim, a voice rang out from behind the rebel. We're not done yet. It was his allies striking from the shadows. More than he had realized were even alive. The battle was about to escalate into something far beyond the walls of this prison. But could they survive long enough to fight it? The rebel didn't have time to think. He turned to face the creature, his hands shaking but his resolve clear. The creature loomed before them, its massive form casting a long shadow across the control room. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowed an eerie, unnatural hue, reflecting a hunger that sent chills down the rebel's spine. He barely had time to process the situation before his allies, those few who had managed to survive the onslaught, rushed into the room, weapons raised. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and underprepared, but they were not without resolve. The rebel's heart raced. He didn't know how long they could hold off the creature, or if they could even escape at all. Every muscle in his body screamed to fight, to find some way to break through this impossible situation. But one thing was clear: they couldn't just run anymore. This wasn't just about escape, it was about survival. The figure who had manipulated everything, the one who had orchestrated this deadly game, stepped back, almost as if in admiration. You've made your choice, they said, their voice as cold as the steel walls around them. Now, face the consequences. The rebel's eyes never left the creature. It was shifting, its form undulating in ways that were both terrifying and alien. He could feel the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. There was no way out, not now. The prison had been a means of containing something much worse than he had ever imagined, and the creature was only the beginning. But then, something changed. As the rebel and his team braced for the inevitable, the creature paused. Its movements slowed, and for a moment, it almost seemed to hesitate. The rebel's instincts screamed that this was their chance. He shouted at his allies to hold their ground, knowing they couldn't waste a single moment of this unexpected reprieve. With one final, desperate move, the rebel sprinted toward the control panel. He could hear the warden's voice shouting behind him, but he didn't stop. The fate of everyone in this prison, maybe even the future of humanity, rested on him now. As his fingers flew across the console, he found the override he needed. It was a long shot, but he activated it with everything he had left. The entire prison shook once more, and then, slowly, the creature began to retract. Its massive form retreated, drawn back into the containment chamber, as if the walls themselves had remembered their purpose. The rebel exhaled in relief, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The warden's face twisted in fury, but he was powerless now. His empire of control had crumbled along with the prison's walls, the creatures they had so desperately sought to contain, and all the lies they had fed to the people. The rebel's breath came in short bursts, but his heart steadied. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The rebellion had just been ignited. But even as the warden and his men were subdued, the rebel couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. The prison had held something far more dangerous than he had expected, and as he glanced back at the mysterious figure who had orchestrated so much of it, he realized that the true battle was still ahead. "Is it really over?" one of his allies asked, their voice filled with uncertainty. The rebel didn't have an answer. But he knew one thing: he had set something in motion. The Empire had underestimated humanity's resolve, its capacity to adapt, to rise against impossible odds. And now, the truth was out there, no longer buried in the shadows. The rebellion had begun, and there would be no stopping it. As the team exited the facility, the rebel looked back one last time, the walls of the prison now a symbol of their freedom and of the fight to come. They had just scratched the surface of what was to come, and the road ahead would be filled with danger and uncertainty. But the rebel was ready. The battle wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for the future.